Welcome to Astral Time Walker, a history sleep story channel designed to help you relax, unwind, and fall asleep while drifting gently through the past. In this video, you will be calmly guided through a second-person retelling of an evening in Chang'an during the Tang dynasty. The narration will slowly fade into a soothing auditory ambience aimed to gently put you to sleep. Turn your brightness low, your volume at a comfortable level, and your mind to rest. Enjoy. Chapter 1. The golden hour approaches. The last of the sun's fire bled across the western plains, a final defiant salute before night claimed the land. It was in this gilded, transient moment that the city revealed its true nature, not as a mere settlement of men, but as a mountain range forged by human ambition. The walls of Chang'an rose from the earth like a cliff face, their rammed earth cores sheathed in dark brick, stretching farther than the eye could follow in either direction. The Mingda Gate, the southern portal to this universe, was a titanic shadow against the dying light, its multiple arched gateways swallowing the dwindling river of humanity that sought entry before the night bells rang. To pass beneath its vault was to feel the weight of an empire settle upon one's shoulders. Inside, the scale became a geometry of staggering order. Chang'an was a perfect rectangle, a celestial diagram made terrestrial, divided by arrow-straight avenues into 110 walled wards, each a city within the city. The grand axis was the Vermilion Bird Avenue, a central thoroughfare of such impossible breadth, 500 feet of packed earth and drainage canals, that it seemed less a street and more a barren ceremonial plain. Even now, as dusk deepened, it hummed with movement. Carts laden with the day's last deliveries creaked north toward the markets. Mounted messengers, tokens of office flashing, kicked up spirals of ochre dust as they sped on imperial errands. Squads of guards in lamella armour marched with a rhythmic clatter, their faces set and impersonal. The air was a tapestry of scents, woven thick and complex. The dry, pungent smell of dust kicked up by 1,000 feet, and wheels mingled with the sharp tang of animal sweat from oxen and horses. Beneath it all, carried on the cooling breeze from the labyrinth of wards, drifted the promise of evening meals, the savoury scent of roasting meat, the earthy fragrance of steaming millet, the faint, sweet note of fermented rice wine. Voices rose in a cacophonous chorus, the guttural shouts of carters, the melodic calls of vendors packing their stalls, the sing-song chatter of a group of Sogdian merchants in embroidered coats, their words of foreign music. A palanquin borne by 4 sweating men brushed past, its silk curtains drawn, hinting at secrets and status, moving unseen through the throng. This was the zenith, the glittering peak of the Tang, under the reign of Emperor Xuanzong, who styled himself Minghuang, the brilliant monarch. The empire stretched from the steppes of Central Asia to the jungles of Annam, and its capital was the beating heart of the world. Chang'an was not merely Chinese, it was cosmopolitan. Here the silks of the east met the glassware of the west. Zoroastrian priests from Persia walked the same streets as Buddhist monks from India and Nestorian Christians from Syria. Uyghur horsemen, their hair in long braids, rubbed shoulders with Korean scholars and Japanese envoys who had come to learn from the source of civilization itself. The city thrived on this exchange, a colossal engine powered by trade, tribute, and an unshakable belief in its own cultural supremacy. The light was failing fast, turning from gold to deep violet. The purpose of the journey, a quest for a specific text rumoured to be in the library of a retired minister, in the tranquil Xuanping ward, felt both urgent and trivial amidst this overwhelming spectacle. The administrative clock of the city was ticking. Soon the night bell would sound from the drum towers, and the great ward gates would swing shut, segmenting the metropolis into a honeycomb of isolated cells until dawn. The final stretch of the journey had to be navigated now, through the orderly grid, past the closed gates of the Eastern Market, into the residential maze, where the colossal noise of the avenues softened into the domestic clatter of a million lives being lived behind high blank walls. The golden hour was ending, and with it the city's public face. What remained was to find a doorway into its private soul before the curfew sealed everything away. Chapter 2: The Eastern Market, Part 1. Leaving the monumental silence of the Vermilion Bird Avenue felt like stepping from a cathedral nave into a riotous living hive. The Eastern Market, one of the two colossal commercial hearts of Chang'an, occupied two entire wards, its perimeter walls a mere formality against the torrent of commerce that spilled from its gates. The transition was not gradual but immediate, a sensory onslaught that replaced the wide, dusty avenues with a labyrinth of organised frenzy. Under a vast sky, now the colour of a deep bruise, thousands of lanterns were being lit, their warm, bobbing glow transforming the market from a daytime workplace into a nocturnal carnival of consumption. The market's internal structure was a masterpiece of bureaucratic order imposed upon natural chaos. 9 grid-like lanes, each dedicated to a specific guild, crisscrossed the space. The air, thick and palpable, was a compound of 100 distinct smells: wood smoke, animal musk, drying herbs, hot metal, and the underlying sweet rot scent of humanity packed tight. The cacophony was a physical force, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of fullers beating cloth, the screech of saws on timber, the incessant clatter of abacus beads, and the layered cries of vendors hawking their wares in a dozen languages, all merging into a single booming hum of transaction. The first lane belonged to the Textile Guild, a river of colour and texture flowing under covered arcades. Here the wealth of the empire was unfurled in bolts of silk so fine they seemed woven from cloud. Sichuan brocade, heavy with intricate patterns of phoenixes and peonies in gold and azure thread, lay piled like treasure. There was Huchu linen, crisp and pale, and the vibrant, floral patterned silks of the Yangtze Delta, known as Ling. Merchants, their fingers nimble and eyes sharp, ran hands over the surfaces, feeling for weight and weave, their negotiations a silent dance of gestures and narrowed eyes. Adjacent was the lane of ceramics, a quieter but no less valuable realm. The pale celadon green glaze of yuezhu, delicate as frozen jade, caught the lantern light on wine cups and slender vases. The robust, creamy white Xingzhou porcelain, destined for the tables of the elite, stood in orderly rows. But the true objects of reverence were the pieces from the southern kilns, their surfaces adorned with cobalt blue motifs from Persia, a perfect fusion of Tang craft and foreign taste, each one a testament to the Silk Road's influence on the very aesthetics of the empire. It was the spice and incense lane, however, that most vividly announced the market's global reach. Here, the air grew dense and fragrant, a tapestry of exotic notes, mountains of peppercorns, black gold from the southern islands, filled woven baskets, stick of cinnamon, curls of sandalwood, and the strange resinous lumps of frankincense formed miniature landscapes on merchant stalls. And here, amidst this olfactory symphony, the foreign merchants held court, A Persian, his beard perfumed and curled, presided over a stall of rare aromatics. His hands, moving with priestly care, sifted through myrrh, explaining in careful, accented Chinese how the tears of resin were harvested from the thorny trees of the distant Arabian Peninsula, surviving the perilous journey across the western seas and the treacherous Jade Gate to reach this ultimate marketplace. His neighbour was a Sogdian, a man whose leathery face was a map of desert crossings and mountain passes. His trade was not spices but horsepower, the literal engine of empire and commerce. He spoke of the Fergana horses, the celestial steeds so prized by the Tang cavalry, describing their powerful haunches and spirited nature as another man might describe fine jewellery. He verified the routes, the northern path skirting the Taklamakan's dread dunes, and the southern track through the Pamir passes, each journey a year-long gamble against bandits, storms, and thirst. His stories were not mere boasts, they were the oral ledgers of the Silk Road, confirming that the luxuries on every surrounding stall, the glassware, the lapis lazuli, the ivory, were not abstractions but cargo that had trembled on the backs of carts and camels over continents, their value multiplied by every mile of dust and danger. This human river of commerce, fed by 1,000 such trickles from across the known world, was the true lifeblood of Chang'an's golden age. The market was more than a place of exchange. It was a living proof of the Tang's gravitational pull, drawing the world's treasures and those who carried them into its orderly, voracious embrace. As the lantern flames danced in the deepening night, the market buzzed with a relentless energy, a monument not to stone, but to the flow of silver, silk, and ambition. Chapter 2. The Eastern Market, Part 2. The commercial grandeur of the guild lanes gave way, deeper within the market's humming core, to a more fundamental economy, that of sustenance and service. Here the air grew warmer, steamier, and infinitely more tantalizing. This was the district of immediate gratification, where the wealth from silks and spices was converted into the simple, profound currency of a filled belly and a moment's respite. Food stalls, their canopies stained with years of smoke and grease, formed a bustling, aromatic maze. At one, a cook with forearms like knotted rope performed a mesmerizing dance. He wielded a sheet of dough, slapping it against a floured board with a rhythmic, resonant biang-biang sound, each impact stretching the paste into long belt-like noodles before he flung them into a roiling bronze cauldron. Beside him, bamboo steamers towered, puffing clouds of fragrant vapour that promised the soft, pillowy comfort of mantu, plain wheat buns whose simplicity was their virtue. But the most seductive scent came from charcoal braziers where rows of lamb skewers sizzled, their fat dripping onto the coals with a hiss that sent up flares of aromatic smoke, the meat glistening under a glaze of cumin and crushed pepper. Customers, from weary porters to clerks with ink-stained fingers, clustered around low benches, their faces illuminated by the cooking fires, a silent communion of shared hunger, satisfied. This bounty of food was made possible by an unseen marvel, Chang'an's water. A network of carefully engineered canals, channels, and underground conduits brought fresh water from the nearby rivers and springs into the very heart of the city. One could glimpse these watercourses at the edges of the market, stone-lined channels where clear water flowed, used for washing goods, watering the draft animals, and supplying the countless tea houses that dotted the periphery. These tea houses were oases of relative calm, their interiors hazy with steam from large iron kettles. Here people not only drank the infused leaves, a practice spreading from the monasteries to the populace, but also socialised, sealing deals begun in the guild lanes, or simply watching the market's pageant from a seated vantage. The tea house was a neutral ground, a place where the hierarchy of the streets softened into the communal ritual of the shared pot. Nearby, in quieter stalls shielded from the food market's clamour, other essential trades operated. Scribes sat cross-legged behind low desks, their brushes moving with fluid precision over strips of paper or rolls of silk. For a few coins, they would compose a letter to a distant province, draft a contract for a sale of grain, or pen a poem for a lovesick merchant to send to a courtesan in the Pingkang ward. Theirs was the power of the recorded word, giving permanence to the market's ephemeral transactions. Next to them, in even more discreet alcoves, worked the moneylenders and financial agents. Their trade was not in goods but in trust and credit. They facilitated commerce across vast distances through the use of fakian, flying money, early bills of exchange. A merchant from Yangzhou could deposit his copper cash with a representative here, receive a paper certificate, and have his agent in Luoyang redeem it for currency, bypassing the perilous transport of heavy coinage. These slips of paper, stamped with seals and signatures, were fragile threads that bound the empire's economy together, a testament to sophisticated finance flourishing amidst the market's primal bustle. As the evening deepened, a crowd gathered at a small open square where entertainment was offered. A storyteller, his face animated in the flickering light of a tall lantern, had captivated an audience of all ages. He spun a tale of love and betrayal from the classic ballad of Mulan, his voice dropping to a whisper for moments of pathos, then rising to a dramatic shout for scenes of battle. His performance was punctuated by the sharp clap of bamboo castanets. A few stalls over, a blind musician drew a melancholic tune from a two-stringed erhu, his bowl collecting coins from passers-by, moved by the sorrowful melody. These entertainers provided the narrative and emotional soundtrack to the market's relentless materialism, reminding all that commerce existed within a larger human drama of desire, loss, and wonder. This ecosystem, the sizzling skewers, the flowing water, the scratch of the scribe's brush, the promise of the fakian note, and the storyteller's cadence, formed the complete anatomy of daily life. It was a self-sustaining world where every physical need and many social ones could be met, grounded in the practical realities of Tang engineering, law, and custom. The Eastern Market was not just a place to buy exotic luxuries. It was where the city fed itself, financed its ambitions, documented its dealings, and briefly forgot them in a shared bowl of noodles or a well-told tale. As the lanterns burned and the night bell's first, distant toll loomed in the imagination, this sector of the market pulsed with a vital, gritty authenticity, the unglamorous but indispensable foundation upon which the glittering empire was built. Chapter 3: The Lanes of the Pingkang Ward. The resonant closing of the Eastern Market's great wooden gates was a sound felt more than heard, a deep, final shudder in the twilight. It signalled a transition as profound as the shift from day to night. The crowd's energy, once diffused across the market's grid, now channeled itself into a single, purposeful flow northward, toward a district where light and sound did not diminish with the hour, but intensified. This was the Pingkang Ward, the most prestigious of Chang'an's entertainment quarters, a walled enclave where the elite came to shed the formal skin of their public lives. The ward's main lane was a canyon of cultivated elegance, a stark contrast to the market's utilitarian bustle. High whitewashed walls, topped with dark glazed tiles, hid the residences of high officials and wealthy merchants. But between these bastions of austere privilege stood other gateways, wider and more inviting, framed by intricately carved wooden archways, from which hung lanterns of silk and painted parchment. These were the pleasure houses, their illuminated facades spilling pools of golden light onto the swept flagstones, and their open upper windows releasing tendrils of sandalwood incense and the faint, tantalizing strains of music. The air here was perfumed, not with dust or food, but with the scent of money and desire, a subtle, expensive fragrance that spoke of transactions far more complex than the mere exchange of coin for goods. Inside one such establishment, the reality of the gaugee, the courtesan, unfolded with a quiet, disciplined artistry far removed from the vulgar caricatures of popular imagination. A young woman, perhaps 18, sat in a chamber that was a testament to refined taste. The walls were hung with monochrome landscape paintings, and a single spray of plum blossoms stood in a celadon vase. Her attire was elegant, but not ostentatious. A robe of deep indigo silk, its only adornment a subtle silver thread embroidery at the cuffs. Her face was painted with the fashionable white powder and red lip stain, but her expression was one of composed intelligence, not empty allure. Her education had been rigorous, a years-long apprenticeship under a retired gaugee of repute. She had been drilled in the classics, taught to compose regulated verse in the style of the masters, to play the pipa and the guzheng with technical precision and emotional depth, and to converse on topics ranging from court politics to Taoist philosophy. Her value was not in physical availability, but in her ability to be the perfect, stimulating companion, a living embodiment of the cultured ideals her clients aspired to possess. She was a mirror, reflecting back a man's sophistication, and a sanctuary where he could briefly exist as a poet-scholar, not merely a bureaucrat or merchant. This cultural theatre reached its zenith in the banquet hall. A party of officials and literati, their formal court robes exchanged for more comfortable gowns of fine hemp and silk, reclined on cushioned platforms around low lacquered tables. The room was a constellation of lantern light, shimmering off the surfaces of bronze wine warmers and porcelain dishes bearing delicate sweets. The atmosphere was one of convivial competition and performative ease. A gaugee, her instrument cradled like a precious child, plucked the strings of her pipa. The melody was not a frivolous tune, but a complex, mournful piece inspired by the frontier ballads of the Western marches, her fingers dancing over the frets to produce cascading notes that spoke of vast deserts and lonely watchtowers. The true currency of the evening, however, was poetry. A guest warmed by cups of heated dew would rise to recite a new work. The verses were often spontaneous, composed in the moment to capture the mood, the melancholy of autumn, the fleeting joy of friendship, the bitterness of exile masked as romantic longing. The name on everyone's lips, the spectral guest of honour at every such gathering, was Li Bai. His verses, circulating on scraps of paper copied and recopied by admiring hands, were the standard against which all others were measured. When a man recited Li Bai's lines about drinking alone with the moon as his companions, a hush fell over the room. The words were an incantation, conjuring the very spirit of Tang romanticism, the boundless, untamed individualism, the cosmic loneliness, and the defiant joy that resonated deeply with men bound by the strictures of court and examination. The Geiji might later be asked to sing the poem, setting the words to one of the official banquet melodies, her clear voice transforming personal sentiment into shared cultural experience. This world was a meticulously maintained illusion, a gilded stage where power, art, and commerce performed an intricate, unspoken dance. The laughter was measured, the drunkenness often strategic, the friendships forged over shared verses potentially useful in tomorrow's political machinations. The Pingkang ward offered not base escapism, but a heightened, more aesthetically perfect version of reality itself. As the night deepened and the wine flowed, the boundaries between patron and artist, between genuine feeling and skilled performance, blurred into a pleasant, golden haze. The ward's high walls kept the common night at bay, preserving within its lanes a fragile, luminous bubble where the empire's elite could pretend, for a few precious hours, that life was composed solely of beauty, melody, and well-turned verse, a dream of civilization sustained by silver and desire until the inevitable dawn. Chapter 4: The Sound of the Night Bell. It began not as a sound but as a vibration in the soles of the feet, a deep, resonant shudder that travelled up through the flagstones of the Pingkang ward's elegant lane. A moment later, the air itself thickened with the boom, a single monumental note from the great bell in the central drum tower, its iron tongue striking against bronze with an authority that brooked no argument. The night bell. Its voice rolled across the 110 wards, a wave of sonic command that instantly stilled the lingering laughter from the banquet halls and hushed the final transactions at the wine shops. The golden hour was irrevocably over. The Empire's official night had begun. The effect was a city-wide mechanism clicking into place with terrifying efficiency. From the vantage point of a high rooftop garden, borrowed from a sympathetic host, the process unfolded like a silent, geometric dance. In every direction, at the mouths of each walled ward, massive wooden gates, reinforced with iron bands, began to swing inward. Teams of ward guards, their torches tiny pinpricks of moving orange in the deepening blue, heaved at the counterweighted beams, their distant shouts swallowed by the bell's fading echo. With a series of final echoing thuds that sounded like the locking of a colossal prison, the gates met their jams. Chang'an, the world's most open metropolis, was now a mosaic of sealed compartments, each ward an island isolated from its neighbours until dawn. On the grand avenues, a new rhythm asserted itself. The civilian bustle, the carts, the pedestrians, the late returning merchants, vanished as if swept away by an invisible tide. In its place came the measured, metallic tread of the city guard, the Junwu. Patrols of 20 men, clad in dark lacquered lamella armour and armed with long halberds, marched in grim unison down the centre of the Vermilion Bird Avenue, their torchlight glinting off helmet and blade. Their jurisdiction was absolute during the night watches. Any citizen found outside without a lantern and a valid, wax-sealed permit from a high official was subject to immediate arrest, or if they fled, to being summarily struck down. The law was explicit and harsh, a necessary discipline for a city of over 1 million souls. The public sphere, with all its chaotic vitality, was now a military domain. The wide streets, empty arteries, under a cold canopy of stars. Inside the wards, the transformation was equally profound, but of a different nature. The sudden enclosure forced a shift from the external to the internal, from the civic to the domestic. The lanes, so recently filled with the comings and goings of servants and visitors, fell into a profound quiet, broken only by the scurry of a cat or the muffled sound of a bolt being thrown on a heavy door. Behind the high walls, life contracted into pools of lantern light. Through latticed windows, one could see the intimate silhouettes of families gathered for their final meal, or a solitary scholar bending over his books, his world shrunk to the circle of illumination cast by a single oil lamp. The cacophony of the day softened into a mosaic of private sounds. The faint pluck of a guzheng from a courtyard, the murmur of conversation, the clatter of dishes being cleared. The city's immense energy, once broadcast across its grid, was now contained and recycled within a million separate rooms. From the rooftop, the view was breathtaking in its stark order. The darkened city stretched to the horizon, a vast black plain etched with the faint, ruler straight lines of the walls dividing the wards. Within each black rectangle, the yellow glow of domestic lanterns sparkled like fireflies trapped in a grid of inkwells, a constellation of earthly stars mirroring the heavens above. But to the north, one area blazed with undiminished light, a permanent false dawn on the horizon. The imperial city, and within it, the palace complex itself, was exempt from the curfew's gloom. There, in halls of cedar and cypress, the business of empire continued through the night. Messengers came and went, ministers conferred in anxious whispers, and the emperor, the son of heaven, might be poring over memorials from distant provinces. That distant, unwavering glow was a potent reminder of the central power that enforced this nightly peace, the ultimate source of the bell's command. The social order enforced by this diurnal rhythm was absolute. The curfew was the great leveller and the great divider. It protected property and prevented unrest, but it also rigidly defined the boundaries of class and function. The official in his mansion, the merchant in his compound, the artisan in his small house, all were equally prisoners of their wards, yet the quality of their confinement differed vastly. For the wealthy, the night was a time for private banquets, music and poetry within their own expansive courtyards. For the poor, it was simply a long, dark interval of rest in cramped quarters, a suspension of labour. The system proclaimed that the collective safety of the whole outweighed the freedom of the individual, a Confucian ideal of order made manifest in wood, iron and law. It created two distinct cities, the daytime city of commerce, administration and visible social hierarchy, and the nighttime city of isolation, introspection and hidden life. As the moon climbed, cold and clear, the silence deepened. The guard patrols became infrequent spectres in the distance. The domestic lanterns, one by one, winked out. The city seemed to hold its breath. The night bell's single commanding note had orchestrated this transformation, replacing the vibrant, chaotic symphony of the day with a slow, deep adagio of rest and surveillance. In the profound quiet, broken only by the occasional bark of a watchdog or the call of the night watchman marking the hour, one felt the immense, disciplined weight of the Tang state. It was a peace that was both protective and oppressive, a silence that spoke of control so complete it had become invisible, woven into the very fabric of the night. The rooftop observer finally descended, leaving the panoramic view for the enclosed safety of a guest chamber, carrying with them the indelible image of the darkened segmented metropolis, a monument to order, sleeping under the watchful eyes of its guards and its emperor. Chapter 5. A Feast Under Lanterns, Part 1. The invitation, delivered on a slip of crimson paper by a servant in muted grey robes, was a key to a world behind walls. It led not to the public spectacle of the Pingkang ward, but to the private sanctum of a scholar official's residence in the tranquil Xuanping ward. After the enforced silence of curfew, the journey there felt like a clandestine passage. The ward's main lanes were dark and still, the only light spilling from the occasional gatehouse where a dozing servant kept watch. Then, a turn into a narrower alley, and a doorway appeared, unassuming but for the quality of its dark timber and the two glowing lanterns that flanked it. Their painted silk shades depicting cranes soaring among pine branches. A soft knock was answered immediately, the door swinging inward to reveal a courtyard transformed into an oasis of light and warmth against the vast, sleeping city. The courtyard was a carefully composed landscape of cultivated leisure. A miniature rock garden, with its carefully raised gravel and artfully placed stones, lay to one side, a frozen meditation on mountain ranges. A slender ginkgo tree, its fan-shaped leaves tinged with autumn gold, stood sentinel. But the centrepiece was the banquet pavilion, its wooden lattice walls open to the cool night air, its roof a graceful sweep of tile. Inside, a dozen individual lacquered tables, each no higher than a knee, were arranged in a precise semicircle, facing the courtyard's view, their placement a silent map of status. The host's table sat centrally, flanked by those of the guests of highest rank, with others radiating outward in descending order of importance. Low, cushioned platforms awaited the guests, who would dine not seated upright, but in the comfortable, reclining posture of zuoji, a mark of informal elegance and scholarly ease. The air was fragrant with a sophisticated blend of aromas, the clean scent of polished wood, the delicate perfume of chrysanthemums arranged in bronze vessels, and the underlying, tantalizing promise of the feast to come. Service began with a silent, fluid ballet performed by a team of household servants. Each guest was presented with a set of personal dining ware, a celadon glazed bowl, a small plate of matching hue, a shallow cup for wine, and the essential utensils, a bronze spoon and a pair of lacquered chopsticks, their tips slender and precise. The first dishes arrived not as a single course, but as a simultaneous offering of contrasting flavours and textures laid out upon the individual tables like edible art. A small bowl held Shengxian, a salad of raw fish slices, carp from the palace ponds, marinated in vinegar, ginger, and scallions, its translucence a testament to absolute freshness. Beside it sat a dish of luo, a fermented meat specialty from the south. The dark, pungent paste of minced pork and goose, aged with rice and salt, was an acquired taste, a complex umbra of flavour that spoke of preservation and culinary daring. It was served with slivers of crisp, raw vegetable to cut its richness. The true symbol of luxury, however, was not on the plate, but in a small lidded jar placed with ceremony near the host. Pepper. The black wrinkled berries imported at staggering cost from the distant spice islands of the southern seas were worth their weight in silver. A servant used a tiny ivory spoon to dispense a precious dusting over a select dish, a stew of tender lamb and turnips, its sharp aromatic heat a visceral display of the host's wealth and global connections. Every bite infused with it was a consumption of geography and commerce, a taste of the Silk Road's farthest reach. Other dishes followed in a steady, unhurried procession, steamed dumplings shaped like crescent moons, filled with minced pheasant, a clear, delicate broth with floating wisps of egg and seaweed, stir-fried young greens with slivers of garlic, and bowls of perfectly steamed millet, the staple grain that anchored the meal's extravagance. As the warm, fragrant dew was poured from long-necked ewers into the cups, the conversation, initially polite and observational, began to deepen, turning inevitably toward the engine that powered the lives of every educated man in the room, the civil service examinations. The atmosphere grew thick with a shared, anxious ambition. A young guest, his robe still new and stiff, spoke with a fervent, nervous energy about his upcoming attempt at the Jinshi degree, the most prestigious and difficult of all. He had spent years memorizing the Confucian classics, practicing the intricate, 1,000-character-long policy essays, and perfecting his poetry in the prescribed forms. His future, his family's honour, his very identity hinged on the verdict of the examiners in the Gongyuan, the walled examination compound. His voice held a mixture of terror and desperate hope, a reflection of the countless scholars across the empire who submitted themselves to this brutal, meritocratic sieve. An older man, a mid-level secretary in one of the ministries who had earned his position 2 decades prior, listened with a weary, knowing expression. He offered cautious advice, speaking of the importance of stylistic flourish as much as doctrinal correctness, and of the unspoken advantage of having a patron, a powerful recommender, within the bureaucracy. His words peeled back the ideal of pure merit to reveal the reality of networks and influence that operated beneath the official surface. The talk then drifted, as it always did, among the politically aware, to the shifting winds at court. Names were mentioned in hushed, respectful tones. The chief minister, Li Linfu, known for his ruthless efficiency and tighter grip on power. The rising military governors on the frontiers, like An Lushan, whose forces grew ever stronger. The speculation was cautious, veiled in allegory and historical precedent, but a faint undercurrent of concern was palpable. The brilliant stability of Xuanzong's reign felt to these keen observers like a perfectly balanced vase upon a high shelf. The admiration for its beauty was inseparable from a nervous awareness of the long drop below. The feast, for all its sensory splendour, was also a delicate sounding of depths, a sharing of hopes and fears under the benevolent glow of the lanterns, as the flavours of empire, the fermented, the fresh, the precious, and the peppered, lingered on the tongue. Chapter 5. A Feast Under Lanterns, Part 2. As the last savoury dishes were cleared, the banquet's focus shifted from a sustenance to sport and intellect, a transition marked by the arrival of a fresh, stronger vintage of dew and a shallow bronze bowl filled with ivory tally sticks. The host, his face flushed with congenial warmth, proposed a round of duelling, the drinking game of poetic command. The rules were deceptively simple, yet demanded quick wit and deep learning. A master of ceremonies chosen by lot would draw a stick inscribed with a theme, perhaps Autumn River, Lonely Goose, or Forgotten Sword. He would then recite a line of classical poetry containing that theme. The guest to his left had to respond instantly with another line from a different poem that connected, either through shared imagery, opposing sentiment, or clever wordplay. Hesitation, repetition, or a flawed connection meant draining one's cup. The game was a thrilling liquid test of cultural literacy, a performance where a man's worth was measured in memorized verses and the speed of his associative mind. Laughter erupted as a portly merchant, better with numbers than Tang anthologies, fumbled and drank deeply, while a quiet scholar from the provinces surprised everyone with a flawless, obscure couplet that earned nods of respect. The dew flowed more freely, loosening formality and inviting a more collaborative creation. The host produced a long scroll of paper, unrolling it on a low writing desk. A servant ground fresh ink. This was to be a linked verse, a lion due, where each guest contributed a couplet in turn, each line building upon the last to form a single, meandering poem. The opening line, offered by the eldest guest, spoke of jade dust settling on midnight steps, an image of frost and stillness. The next man added motion. A lone lanterns pull through the ward's deep maze. The poem grew organically, a collective breath, weaving together observations of the night, hints of personal longing and classical allusions. It was democracy in art, however temporary, with each voice leaving its mark upon the shared scroll, the brush passing from hand to hand like the cup itself. This spirit of synthesis, of blending disparate threads into a coherent whole, soon infused the conversation, turning it toward the great intellectual currents swirling through the age. A guest with a Taoist priest's simple hairpin spoke with fervent, low-voiced intensity about the quest for the elixir of life. He described the alchemical arts, the careful heating of cinnabar in sealed crucibles, the pursuit of the external Whedon that could purify the body and grant immortality. His words painted a picture of secretive laboratories in mountain retreats, where the transformation of matter mirrored the desired transformation of the self. Yet his discourse was not met with uniform reverence. A Buddhist scholar, his robes dark and plain, countered with a gentle penetrating smile. He spoke not of elixirs, but of emptiness, of the inner alchemy of meditation. True immortality, he suggested, lay not in prolonging the illusory self, but in realizing its fundamental non-existence, in achieving liberation from the cycle of rebirth through wisdom and compassion. The debate was earnest but not acrimonious, a genuine exploration held within the safe container of the banquet. A third voice, that of a career bureaucrat, interjected with the grounded pragmatism of Confucian statecraft. All this talk of immortality and emptiness, while elegant, paled beside the urgent need for righteous governance, for filial piety, and for social harmony here and now. He cited the recent memorials of Han Yu, that staunch defender of the Confucian way, who had famously criticized the emperor's excessive devotion to a Buddhist relic, arguing that such superstition undermined the moral foundations of the state. The table considered this, the tension between the transcendental yearnings of Taoism and Buddhism, and the this-worldly responsibilities of the Confucian gentleman. Yet, in the spirit of the Tang, synthesis was sought. Perhaps, one guest mused, the inner cultivation of the Taoist and the Buddhist could produce a purer, more virtuous official. The debate reflected the empire's intellectual confidence, its ability to hold multiple truths in contention without fracturing. The conversation, expansive with wine and ideas, then turned to the even more exotic beliefs that had journeyed along the Silk Road to nestle within Chang'an's wards. A guest who had served on the western frontier mentioned the Nestorians, those Christians of the East who called their faith the luminous religion. He described their strange cross-top temples in the western market ward and their puzzling belief in a crucified sage god. Another spoke of the Muslims, the Huihe, who came with the caravans from Persia, their prayers directed toward a single, invisible deity in their stark, unadorned mosques, their avoidance of wine and pork a curious abstention. These were not threats but curiosities, further evidence of the capital's cosmic centrality. They were philosophical spices, adding flavour to the great simmering pot of Tang thought. The host summarised the mood, raising his cup. The sage of Lu provided the rules for society. The Buddha and the Tao showed paths beyond it, and the strange gods of the West were testament to the empire's magnetic reach. All could be examined, debated, and contained within the boundless embrace of the Tang worldview. The linked verse was completed, the final couplet speaking of distant bells merging with the dawn's first grey. The scroll was set aside to dry, a tangible artefact of the night's communion. The drinking game had subsided into warm, drowsy camaraderie. The philosophical debates, unresolved and unresolvable, settled into a pleasant hum of residual thought. In this lantern-lit pavilion, the intellectual ferment of the age was made intimate, a microcosm of the golden Tang spirit, worldly yet spiritual, disciplined yet free, profoundly Chinese yet insatiably curious about all under heaven. The feast was concluding, but the ideas it had stirred, like the fragrance of pepper and wine, would linger long in the memory, as complex and layered as the empire itself. Chapter 6. Beyond the City Walls. The final lingering notes of the banquet's poetry seemed to dissolve into the cool air of the courtyard, leaving behind a profound stillness. Sleep in the guest chamber of the Xuanping ward residence was a shallow pool, easily disturbed by the immensity of the city, holding its breath outside the walls. As the deepest hour of the night began to pale towards dawn, a restlessness took hold. The urge arose not to re-enter the waking city, but to step completely outside its monumental frame, to see the capital not as a labyrinth of human design, but as an object in the landscape, the heart of an empire. Moving with the quiet privilege of a guest, one could secure a horse from the host's stable and, with a whispered word to the ward guard at a small postern gate, slip out into the pre-dawn world beyond the walls. The first impression was of staggering space. After the dense walled intimacy of the wards, the world opened into a vast flat plain under a sky that seemed infinitely larger. The air, sharp and clean, carried the scent of damp earth and ripening millet from the surrounding farmlands. Turning in the saddle to look back, Chang'an presented itself as a geometric phantom, a perfect dark rectangle etched against the lesser dark of the land, its silhouette broken only by the faint, glowing ember of the imperial palace at its northern edge. From this distance, the city was a single, slumbering entity, its chaotic human energy contained, its power rendered silent and abstract. It was no longer a place to be navigated, but an idea to be contemplated. To the south of the city, a distinct silhouette pierced the star-faded sky, the giant wild goose pagoda of the Dartian temple. Riding towards it as the first hints of grey touched the horizon, the temple complex emerged from the gloom, its courtyards silent and vast, the pagoda itself, a 7-story square tower of elegant brick, stood as a monument to a different kind of journey. This was the domain of the monk Xuanzang, who had returned decades earlier from a 17-year pilgrimage to India. Within the temple scriptorium, by the light of oil lamps, he and a team of scholarly monks had undertaken a task as monumental as the building of the city walls, the translation of hundreds of Buddhist sutras from Sanskrit into Chinese. The silent halls seemed to echo with that patient intellectual labour, the careful brushstrokes that had domesticated a foreign wisdom and woven it into the fabric of Tang thought. The pagoda was a needle pointing to the heavens, a reminder that Chang'an's connections ran along spiritual as well as commercial routes, drawing in the sacred knowledge of the world. Closer to the southeastern city walls, the landscape softened. Here, the Serpentine River curled through a parkland of willows and artificial lakes, a recreational ground for the common citizens of Chang'an. Now in the pre-dawn, it was deserted, a scene of tranquil beauty. The wooden pleasure boats were moored along the banks, and the pavilions for picnics and poetry competitions stood empty. One could imagine the scene on a festival day. Families spreading mats on the grass, the air filled with the laughter of children flying kites, the water dotted with couples in small skiffs. This was the lung of the city, the space where the rigid social order of the wards relaxed into something more pastoral and playful. It spoke of an empire prosperous enough to grant its people not just sustenance, but leisure, a place for the ordinary joys that underpinned the high culture of the Pingkang ward and the scholarly debates of the banquets. North of the city, on the rising slopes of the plain, the mood shifted again. Here the earth was dotted with solemn man-made hills, the tomb mounds of princes, consorts, and high nobility. These were grassy pyramidal forms, some already centuries old, standing in silent regiments. They were stark reminders of mortality and dynasty, of the individuals whose ambitions and lives had built and been consumed by the empire. In the cool grey light, they were profoundly lonely sentinels. Their presence completed the circle. To the south, the spiritual quest symbolised by the pagoda. To the east, the common life of the river parks. And to the north, the solemn political and personal legacy sealed in the earth. Chang'an sat at the centre of this human constellation, the living engine between the realms of spirit, leisure, and death. As the grey light warmed to a soft rose in the east, the full perspective crystallised. Chang'an was not an island. It was the central node in a vast, trembling web. The Silk Road was not a single trail, but a nervous system, and the city was the brain. The spices in the market, the doctrines in the temples, the patterns on the silks, the very horses in the imperial stables, all were pulses of energy sent along those threads from Kashgar, Samarkand, Baghdad, and beyond. Tributary missions from Korea, Japan, and the kingdoms of the south arrived not just with gifts, but with observers, absorbing the Tang model to replicate at home. The city's true walls were not of earth and brick, but of influence, radiating out across continents, setting fashions, standardizing laws, and propagating a written language that became the currency of East Asian civilization. Its legacy would not be in its imperishable stone, for much would be lost to fire and rebellion, but in the template it provided, the ideal of the planned cosmopolitan capital, the engine of cultural and economic synthesis. A low resonant sound rolled across the plain, not the commanding boom of the night bell, but the lighter, clearer peal of the bell signalling the end of curfew. Back at the Mingda gate, a process as precise as the closing now reversed itself. With great groaning creaks, the colossal wooden gates began to swing outward. From within the city, a muted roar began to build, the sound of a million doors unbolting, of a city inhaling, preparing to exhale its human tide once more. Vendors with carts, farmers with produce, officials on horseback, pilgrims with staves, all gathered in the widening space before the gate, a multicoloured, restless organism ready to flow inward and outward. The dawnlight finally broke over the eastern horizon, striking the pagoda's tiles first, then gliding the crest of the city walls, and finally flooding the plain. The city ceased to be a silhouette and became a thing of substance again, its colours returning. The journey outside the walls was complete. It had revealed that Chang'an's greatest wonder was not its scale or its splendour, but its connectedness. It was a crucible where the world was melted and reformed, a machine for turning diverse inputs into a coherent, dazzling whole. The gates were now fully open. The first carts rattled across the threshold, their drivers blinking in the new sun. The cycle began anew, the city, having slept under guard and stars, now awakened to its eternal purpose: to draw the world in, to process it within its ordered grid, and to send its own refined influence back out, in an endless, breathing rhythm that defined an age. The observer turned their horse and, with the sun at their back, rode towards the open gate, leaving the broad perspective to re-enter the glorious, human-scaled chaos within. We have reached the end of this video's narrative section. What follows is a gentle transition into soothing auditory ambience, aimed at putting you to sleep for good. I hope you have already drifted off into a deep slumber by this point. But if you have not, do not worry. Put your mind at ease, relax your body, and take a few deep breaths. There is nothing left to do. You have reached the end of your day. Have a good night, and may you sleep well.